The private jet worth $150 million sat frozen inside the hangar while the company's biggest contract collapsed hour by hour. A dozen skilled engineers had already failed. The starter sequence locked itself shut, and the control panel displayed an error that appeared in no manual. The chief executive, Amelia Grace, finally ordered someone to call back the man fired days earlier for supposedly refusing to cooperate. When Mason Carter walked through the hangar doors, he did not touch the engine at all. He simply asked one question that silenced the entire room. Who altered that flight log? Stay until the end to learn why the man they fired was the only one who could save them all. On the night before the handover ceremony, the private jet known as the Meridian 9 sat motionless inside Hangar Number 4 at Apex Meridian Aviation, just outside Seattle, Washington. It was the first working prototype of the company's long-range luxury line, valued at $150 million on its own. A separate contract for 3 additional aircraft with an international conglomerate pushed the total value of the deal toward $500 million. By morning, the jet was supposed to complete a final demonstration flight in front of the client, federal regulators, and a room full of nervous investors. Jackson Ryan gave the order to begin the startup sequence. The auxiliary power system came online without issue. The central computer booted cleanly. Fuel pressure climbed to the exact number required for ignition. Then, the moment the engine start command was entered, the entire authorization chain locked itself shut. The screen displayed a short error code that had never once appeared in any technical manual the engineers had ever seen. The team tried restarting the control unit. They swapped the ground power card. They inspected every fuel line by hand. They replaced the pressure sensor twice. Every reading fell within normal range, and still the aircraft refused to wake. Amelia Grace arrived at the hangar still wearing the blazer from her earlier meeting with investors, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She asked Jackson for a repair timeline. He told her he needed at least 2 full days. She reminded him they had barely 10 hours left before the client arrived. Logan Hunter walked in a moment later, his tone calm and certain, and announced that the fault was almost certainly something Mason Carter had left behind before his termination. The name landed heavily in the room and several engineers went quiet. David Connor, the veteran test pilot standing near the cockpit stairs, said flatly that Mason had never sabotaged anything in his life. Logan told him sharply not to speculate. Amelia looked at the aircraft, this single machine now worth more than most of the company's yearly revenue, and understood for the first time just how close everything was to collapsing. A young technician sorting through archived maintenance files found a final note Mason had left behind, buried under routine paperwork nobody had bothered to read. It warned, in plain language, that the aircraft should never be started until the secondary verification chain had been personally checked. No one in the hangar that night had ever heard of a secondary verification chain. Jackson stared at the note for a long moment before setting it down. Somewhere beneath the layers of sensors, fuel lines, and polished aluminum, a question was forming that none of them yet knew how to answer. What exactly was this hidden chain, and why had an entire technical department, filled with capable and experienced engineers, never once been told that it existed at all? Outside the hangar, a light rain had begun to fall over the runway, blurring the reflection of the security lights across the wet tarmac. Somewhere inside that quiet building, a truth was waiting to surface, one far larger than a single stubborn error code. 3 days earlier, Mason Carter had been running the final inspection on the Meridian 9 when he noticed a small inconsistency between the software log and the actual maintenance timeline. A control update for the engine management system had been recorded as installed at 2:14 in the morning. Security footage, however, showed no technical crew inside the hangar at that hour. Mason checked the digital signature attached to the update and found it carried Jackson's authorization code, even though Jackson had not yet formally taken over the project. Mason requested a short delay on the flight schedule so an internal review could take place. Logan refused, warning that any delay would trigger a penalty clause with the client. Mason made no accusations. He simply stated that he could not sign off on the safety certification until someone explained who had modified the system and why. Logan reframed that caution as obstruction. In an emergency meeting, he presented a file suggesting Mason had a long pattern of delaying tests unnecessarily, pulling old incidents out of context until Mason looked like a man who habitually stood in the way of progress. Amelia, facing the possible loss of the entire contract, asked Mason directly whether he had proof the system had been tampered with. Mason admitted he did not have complete evidence yet, only irregularities that troubled him. Logan demanded Mason sign the certification immediately or leave the project. Mason refused to sign. Amelia, under pressure from the board, approved his termination. Mason removed his employee badge from around his neck without argument. He did not plead his case. He said only that the aircraft was not ready to fly. Before he left the building, he quietly handed a data drive containing a backup of the system logs to Charlotte Madison, asking her to open it only if the aircraft developed an error that made no sense. Logan watched that exchange from across the room without saying a word. As Mason walked through the security gate for the last time, a coworker muttered that he had thrown away his entire career over a single line of code. Mason said nothing in return. He drove home to his small apartment on the edge of the city and hung his work uniform in the closet like any other evening. A phone call from his young daughter interrupted the silence, asking only if he would be home in time for dinner. Mason kept the news of his termination to himself and told her simply that he would be home soon. Mason had spent nearly 6 years with the company, long enough to remember when the entire prototype program was little more than a handful of engineers sketching designs on a whiteboard in a rented warehouse. He had believed in the aircraft from the beginning, which was exactly why he could not bring himself to sign a document he did not trust. He had seen colleagues pressured into approving shortcuts before, and he had watched what happened when those shortcuts went unexamined. None of that history mattered to Logan, who saw only a deadline slipping further out of reach and a subordinate who refused to cooperate. Later that night, Logan placed a call to someone whose name never appeared on any company directory. "Carter is off the project," he said quietly, "but he still has a copy." The voice on the other end asked a short question, and Logan answered without hesitation that it would be handled before the situation became a problem for anyone involved. Jackson assembled 10 of the company's most capable engineers from 3 separate departments and split the aircraft into 4 systems for review. One team took the power supply. Another took the fuel lines. A third handled engine control, and the fourth focused on software security. Every step followed correct procedure. The backup power system tested stable. The starter batteries held a full charge. The fuel valves responded exactly as designed. The engine control unit showed no physical damage of any kind. Yet the ignition command was still rejected before fuel ever reached the combustion chamber, which told everyone in the room that the fault lived somewhere in the authorization sequence, not in the hardware itself. Jackson noticed the error code did not belong to the standard fault library at all. It resembled something created specifically for this prototype, something only a small original design team, now long disbanded, would have ever seen. Logan ordered the software wiped and reinstalled from scratch. Jackson pushed back, warning that a full wipe could destroy evidence and ruin the calibration data permanently. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind about whether Logan's instructions could be trusted. Amelia contacted the engine manufacturer directly, and their remote specialists confirmed the engine itself carried no fault whatsoever. The client's representative called soon after, demanding to witness a successful startup before sunrise or the entire agreement would be withdrawn. Rumors had already begun leaking, and the company's stock price started sliding. Evelyn Catherine called an emergency session and gave Amelia 2 hours to produce a solution. One board member suggested simply substituting a different aircraft for the demonstration. Amelia explained that only this particular prototype carried the exact range and cabin configuration promised in the contract. David climbed into the cockpit and discovered the internal system clock sat exactly 47 seconds behind the central server, a gap small enough to escape notice yet large enough to break a time-sensitive verification process. Jackson corrected the clock immediately. The aircraft still refused to start. The error code changed. This time, Charlotte recognized the new string of characters as nearly identical to something on the drive Mason had left with her. She told Amelia quietly that Mason appeared to have predicted this exact failure days in advance. Amelia turned to look at Logan. He immediately objected to calling Mason back, his voice rising with an intensity that felt disproportionate to the moment, and for the first time Amelia felt something close to genuine unease settle over her. She thought back to the termination meeting, to how quickly Logan had produced a thick file of complaints against a man who had otherwise spent years earning a reputation for careful, methodical work. None of the engineers in the hangar that night could explain why a routine startup sequence had turned into a crisis capable of threatening the entire company. Jackson, watching Amelia's expression change, understood that whatever happened next would decide far more than just tonight's demonstration flight. He quietly ordered his team to preserve every log and every physical component exactly as it stood, refusing to let anyone touch the aircraft again until a decision had been made. Amelia tried calling Mason, but he did not answer the first time. She left a message explaining that the Meridian 9 would not start at all. Mason listened to it standing in his darkened kitchen and understood in that instant that the exact scenario he had feared was now unfolding. He did not rush back immediately since his access badge had been deactivated and he no longer held any real authority inside the building. Instead, he called Charlotte to ask about the error code directly. When she read him the string of characters, he asked 3 questions in a row. How far off was the system clock? Did the maintenance log show an update installed at 2:14 in the morning? Had anyone attempted to erase the control memory? Charlotte confirmed the first 2 exactly as he expected. On the 3rd question, she told him Logan was currently pushing to wipe the entire system. Mason told her firmly that they could not allow that to happen. Amelia took the phone and asked Mason directly to come back. He asked under what title he would be returning. She offered a temporary consulting role. Mason rejected the phrasing entirely. He explained he did not need a title, only complete technical authority for the duration of the inspection. No configuration could be altered without his approval, and every action taken had to be recorded and logged without exception. Amelia agreed. Logan objected loudly, suggesting that Mason himself may have created the fault just to force his own return. Mason heard the accusation through the phone and calmly asked Amelia to have Logan repeat that claim directly to the legal department. Logan went silent. Amelia sent a car, but Mason chose to drive his own aging pickup truck instead of accepting the company vehicle. On the drive over, his mind returned to the early days building this very prototype with a small, dedicated team. He remembered that the Meridian 9 carried a protective layer never mentioned in the standard documentation, a safeguard added after a troubling incident during testing 2 years earlier. If the system detected engine data that had been altered without the correct verification sequence, it would lock the entire startup process to prevent a possible accident in the air. Only 3 people fully understood how that mechanism worked: Mason himself, a software engineer who had since retired, and Logan, who had once approved the budget for building it. Mason reached the main gate. His old badge was rejected instantly. The same security guard who had escorted him out 3 days earlier now had to manually open the gate for him. He crossed the lobby under dozens of watching eyes. There was no welcome and no apology waiting for him, only the distant sound of an alarm still echoing from inside the hangar. As he approached the aircraft, he asked one simple question into the silence. Who altered that flight log? No one answered. Logan took a small step backward. Mason set his bag down near the wing and looked around the hangar slowly, taking in the scattered tools, the open panels, and the exhausted faces of engineers who had been working through the night without rest. He did not raise his voice or demand an explanation from anyone in particular. He simply asked for a full account of every action taken since the failed startup, wanting to understand the sequence of events before touching anything himself. Jackson stepped forward first, offering a summary without hesitation, grateful that someone finally seemed to know what question to ask. Mason told everyone to stop swapping parts. He studied the tool carts, the tamper seals, and the order in which components had been removed. It became clear the team had been chasing a hardware failure, while the real problem lived inside the verification chain itself. Mason asked for the Meridian 9 to be connected to an isolated offline server, refusing to trust the internal network he suspected had already been compromised. He retrieved his backup files from Charlotte and compared 3 separate versions of the flight log side by side: the log stored on the aircraft itself, the log stored on the company server, and the copy he had preserved before his termination. All 3 carried the same number of entries, yet the timestamps did not match, which proved someone had not only edited the data but had also constructed a false copy to hide the alteration. Mason discovered the suspicious update did not disable the engine directly. Instead, it quietly reordered the verification sequence between the fuel management system and the engine controller. On the ground, this simply locked the startup process. But if a technician bypassed the safeguard and forced ignition through maintenance mode, the same flaw could reappear mid-flight, potentially tricking the computer into believing fuel pressure had exceeded safe limits and automatically cutting power. David understood the danger immediately. The aircraft could lose thrust during the most vulnerable phase of takeoff. The mood inside the hangar shifted entirely. This was no longer a race to save a contract. It was a conspiracy that could have ended in tragedy. Amelia asked if Mason could fix it. He said the corrupted update could be removed, but first they needed to find every place it might be hiding, since repairing only the aircraft would leave the saboteur free to trigger the flaw again. Mason asked her to shut down the internal technical network entirely. Logan warned that doing so would paralyze the entire company. Mason replied that a system already breached could no longer be trusted at all. Amelia gave the order to cut the network. Logan quietly pulled out his phone and sent a message. Charlotte noticed but could not yet see who received it. Mason inspected the maintenance terminal and found a small converter device hidden behind the control panel, disguised as an ordinary voltage tester, never logged in any asset inventory. The device was capable of recording authentication keys every time an engineer logged in. Jackson realized with a sinking feeling that he had used that very terminal himself, believing it had been approved by Logan. Mason did not blame him. He simply asked for help tracing where the stolen data had gone. The signal led to a secondary server room, one registered under Logan's direct administrative control. When security arrived to check the room, they found the door locked from the inside, and a data deletion program was already counting down. Mason had suspected something like this from the moment he saw the false copy of the flight log, since anyone capable of building a convincing fake would also understand the value of erasing the original evidence entirely. He had warned Charlotte hours earlier to keep her own backup separate from the main servers, a decision that now looked less like caution and more like foresight. Jackson stood beside him, watching the counter on the terminal screen tick downward, and understood for the first time just how deliberately this entire crisis had been engineered from the very beginning. Mason warned everyone not to cut power to the server room, since doing so could trigger an emergency wipe protocol built into the system. Jackson accessed the cooling controls instead, hoping to slow the deletion process without setting it off completely. Charlotte instructed security to record the entire process of opening the locked door. Amelia ordered them to use a manual override key. Inside, the room stood empty. A single terminal was executing a remote deletion command entirely on its own. Mason disconnected the network cable, but the process continued running because the command had already been stored locally. He asked Jackson to copy whatever partitions had not yet been overwritten. The two worked side by side against a shrinking countdown, and together they managed to save roughly a third of the data. Among the recovered fragments were login records tied to Jackson's own credentials. Jackson insisted he had not logged in at those particular times. Hallway camera footage confirmed he had been somewhere else entirely, which meant someone had cloned his access keys without his knowledge. The remaining data showed the hidden device transmitting information to an outside server, one belonging to a small aviation consulting firm. Logan claimed the connection meant nothing, insisting the firm had once performed a routine audit for the company. Charlotte checked the records and discovered that firm had shut down more than half a year earlier. Its final ownership traced back to an investment fund connected to a rival company actively pursuing a takeover of Apex Meridian. Amelia began assembling the pieces herself: the falling stock price, the threatened contract, a prototype on the verge of public failure, a competitor poised to acquire the company at a reduced price. Still, nothing directly proved that Logan himself had personally ordered the sabotage. Mason returned to the Meridian 9 and discovered the malicious update contained two separate layers. The first caused the visible startup lock. The second lay hidden inside the backup control unit. If the team had simply removed the first layer, the aircraft might have started, but the second layer would have remained active and dangerous. This explained exactly why the saboteur had wanted the entire system wiped and reinstalled, since that very process would have unknowingly activated the infected backup configuration. Mason concluded that whoever built this had intimate knowledge of internal procedure. David asked whether they could simply replace the entire control unit. Mason said that would require at least 2 full days for proper calibration, and they had only 4 hours remaining. He proposed rebuilding a clean software environment from the aircraft's original source files, but those files were stored inside the technical vault, and when Amelia checked, the original data drive was missing entirely. Logan pointed out that Mason himself had once held access to that vault, and suspicion briefly turned back toward him. Amelia studied his face, waiting for a reaction. Mason simply asked her to check the sensor log recording the vault's weight over time. The record showed the drive had been removed the very night Mason was terminated, after his badge access had already been revoked, using an administrative code reserved only for vice presidents. Only Logan and Amelia held that code. Amelia knew, with absolute certainty, that she had never opened that vault herself. She stood in the corridor outside the technical vault for a long moment, replaying every conversation she'd had with Logan over the past several days, searching for a sign she might have missed. He had always seemed so composed, so willing to shoulder difficult decisions on her behalf, and she realized now that composure could just as easily be a mask as a virtue. Charlotte gently reminded her that suspicion was not proof, and that the next step had to be building a case that would hold up beyond this single night. Mason agreed, adding that the priority remained the aircraft itself, since a courtroom victory would mean little if the Meridian 9 still carried a hidden flaw capable of endangering a flight crew. Logan did not panic. He calmly suggested that his administrative code could have been cloned just as easily as Jackson's credentials had been. He turned the accusation back around, claiming Mason had orchestrated the entire crisis from the very beginning. According to his argument, Mason alone understood the hidden safeguard. Mason alone kept a backup of the logs. Mason alone had somehow predicted the exact error code, and Mason alone possessed the knowledge needed to fix it. A few board members began to wonder aloud whether Mason had manufactured this entire crisis simply to prove his own value to the company. Evelyn instructed security to detain Mason until federal investigators could arrive. Amelia hesitated. Mason calmly surrendered his phone and his keys, but asked to continue working on the aircraft under direct supervision. Logan proposed canceling the flight altogether and publicly announcing that the prototype suffered from a fundamental design flaw. Mason understood immediately that Logan's true goal was no longer simply preventing a successful startup. He wanted the company to publicly declare the entire design a failure, a statement that would instantly collapse the value of the underlying technology. Charlotte received an alert about unusual trading activity. A trust account had placed a substantial bet that Apex Meridian's stock would fall sharply. The final beneficiary of that trade had not yet been identified. Logan abruptly announced that Mason was simply wasting valuable time. He ordered Jackson to force the engine into maintenance mode to prove it still functioned mechanically. Mason warned strongly against it. Logan invoked his authority as vice president and instructed a different engineer to carry out the command instead. Amelia finally sided fully with Mason and overruled the order. Logan understood in that moment that control was slipping entirely out of his hands. He triggered a contingency plan. Every light in the hangar went dark at once. Emergency backup power returned a few seconds later. In the darkness, the clean backup drive Mason had been protecting was stolen from the workstation. A security officer was struck unconscious in the corridor. A side exit swung open. Mason chased after the figure carrying the stolen drive, and it was not Logan at all, but a contract technician named Aaron. Aaron sprinted toward the service vehicle area. Mason did not attempt any reckless pursuit. Instead, he used the facility's communication system to have the gates sealed and to direct security toward Aaron's exact position. Aaron was cornered but threw the drive into a storm drain before he could be stopped. Mason recovered it, but the outer casing had cracked and the internal circuit was already wet. Aaron refused to speak. His phone held only one message, reading simply, "Make it disappear before 3 in the morning." The number that sent it belonged to a disposable line, untraceable and already dead. Logan still had not been directly connected to any of it. Mason examined the damaged drive and found one memory chip still intact. Jackson believed the data could be recovered, though it would take considerable time. Mason suddenly remembered that during the very first test flight years earlier, he had personally stored a minimal safe configuration inside the navigation computer used that day. That old computer had long since been removed from the Meridian 9 and placed in a storage warehouse, and records showed it was scheduled to be destroyed that very morning. When the technical team reached the warehouse, the transport truck carrying the equipment had already left the property. Mason and Amelia watched through the rain as the truck pulled toward the main gate. If that navigation computer was destroyed, there would be no remaining clean copy of the software capable of saving the Meridian 9 before the deadline arrived. Amelia gripped the door handle as the security vehicle accelerated through the wet streets, watching the taillights of the transport truck disappear and reappear through the downpour ahead of them. Mason stayed calm, running through the layout of the old warehouse in his mind, trying to remember exactly where that particular crate had been stored the last time he had seen it. Charlotte worked her phone the entire ride, trying every contact she had at the transport company, determined to find someone with the authority to stop the truck before it reached its destination. Amelia called the transport company directly and demanded the truck return immediately. The dispatcher explained the destruction order had been flagged as high priority and could not be reversed without Logan's personal confirmation code. Amelia used her authority as chief executive to cancel the entire shipment order. The driver still did not respond. The tracking system showed the truck heading toward an industrial recycling facility nearly 30 minutes away. Amelia, Mason, and Charlotte climbed into a security vehicle to give chase. Logan had been asked to remain in the hangar, but he claimed sudden illness and vanished from the meeting room. Charlotte immediately alerted security. On the drive, Mason explained why that old navigation computer still mattered so much. During the very first test flight, the team had needed an independent system capable of reverting to a safe configuration if the newer software ever failed. Once the project stabilized, that backup had simply been forgotten in storage. Amelia asked why Mason had never mentioned it before. He told her it had been documented in the original handover file, but the relevant appendix had somehow been removed from current records, proof that internal documentation had been quietly altered over a long period of time. The security vehicle caught up with the truck just outside the recycling facility gate. The driver insisted he was only following instructions issued through the company's automated system. A search of the cargo area confirmed the navigation computer was still there, though the tamper seal had already been broken. One circuit board had been swapped with an unrelated component. Mason searched carefully through the equipment trays and realized whoever swapped the board had not had enough time to remove it from the truck entirely. Footage from inside the truck showed Aaron approaching the cargo before it ever left the company grounds. Mason found the real circuit board hidden beneath a layer of protective padding. They carried the equipment back to the hangar. Meanwhile, Logan attempted to leave the company grounds in his own vehicle, but security stopped him at Amelia's request. Logan grew furious, insisting she had no authority to detain him. Charlotte calmly explained that no one was detaining him, but that law enforcement was already on the way and that no company vehicle would be permitted to leave the property. Logan abandoned the car and walked toward the front gate on foot, calling his attorney as he went. Mason and Jackson connected the recovered circuit board to an isolated system. The safe configuration still existed, though it was more than 10 months out of date. It could not simply be installed directly, since much of the Meridian 9 had since been upgraded. Mason had to rebuild the entire verification chain by combining the original root key, the current calibration tables, and the clean log he had personally preserved. The work would likely take 3 hours, yet only 2 hours remained before the client's extended deadline. Amelia called the client herself and openly admitted the aircraft was undergoing a safety investigation. She did not attempt to hide the crisis. The client agreed to extend the deadline by exactly 1 hour, on the condition that they could observe the remaining testing process directly. For the first time in the entire ordeal, Amelia chose full transparency over protecting the company's image. While rebuilding the data, Mason discovered a hidden digital signature buried inside the malicious update. The signature belonged to a senior executive account, one created from a workstation inside Logan's own office. Logan claimed his computer must have been compromised by someone else. Charlotte then produced the final piece of evidence. Private security footage from inside the boardroom showed Logan personally inserting a storage device into that very computer at 1:58 in the morning. Logan had no remaining explanation. Just before security placed him under formal restriction, he revealed one final detail. The Meridian 9, he said coldly, would never start at all because he had altered more than just the software. The room fell silent at the confession, and for a moment even Logan seemed to realize he had said more than he intended. Amelia stared at him, searching his face for some trace of the colleague she had trusted for years, and found only a stranger staring back. Logan was moved into a secured office, but he refused to say which physical component he had altered. The Meridian 9 contained tens of thousands of individual parts, far too many to inspect in the time remaining. Mason reasoned that Logan could not have swapped anything large, since any major component would have been flagged immediately in the inventory system. Whatever it was had to be small, easy to substitute quietly, capable of corrupting the verification process, and unlikely to trigger an obvious system alert on its own. He returned to the earlier discovery of the 47-second clock discrepancy, a gap that precise did not occur naturally. The security timing system relied on a small oscillation module buried deep within the avionics bay. Mason asked for the panel beneath the equipment floor to be removed. There, a timing synchronization module had been swapped for something that looked almost identical. The serial number on the casing was correct, but the circuit board sealed inside was not the certified original. The counterfeit module introduced a tiny artificial delay, just enough to cause the verification chain to fail again and again. If the team had forced ignition despite the fault, that same delay could have caused the fuel computers to receive mismatched data mid-flight. Jackson searched the parts inventory and located an authentic backup module still in storage. Mason insisted it be tested thoroughly before installation, since he no longer trusted any seal without independent verification. The backup module checked out completely clean. The team replaced the component, loaded the rebuilt clean configuration, and generated a fresh authentication key. Every single action was recorded on camera. The client and federal regulators watched the entire process from an observation room above the hangar floor. Mason did not attempt to do everything alone. He assigned Jackson to verify the software. The power systems engineer confirmed voltage levels independently. The fuel team ran their own pressure checks. David settled into the cockpit, ready at the controls. This division of labor made something clear to everyone watching. Mason was leading a team, not performing some impossible feat by himself. Before attempting ignition, Mason requested one final simulated failure test. Jackson deliberately introduced a timing error on purpose. The system locked exactly as it was designed to. They restored the correct configuration and confirmed the protective layer was finally working properly again. David placed his hand on the starter switch. The entire hangar fell completely silent. The left engine began to turn. Temperature climbed within expected limits. Oil pressure held steady. The engine reached a stable idle. The right engine followed and started successfully as well. The combined sound of both engines filled the enormous hangar space. Several engineers wept openly from sheer relief. Amelia did not celebrate right away. She asked Mason directly whether the aircraft was truly safe to fly. Mason answered simply that a successful start did not automatically mean it was ready for flight. He requested a full engine load test and an extended ground run before anyone considered takeoff. That decision meant the contract deadline remained at risk. This time, Amelia did not push back at all. She said clearly that safety came first, no exceptions. Mason looked at her then with a measure of respect he had not felt in days. He remembered the woman who had approved his termination under pressure only a few days earlier, and he recognized, watching her now, someone who had finally chosen to place caution above convenience. The engineers around them began the long process of preparing for a full ground test, checking fuel flow, monitoring temperature curves, and recording every data point twice over. No one in the hangar was in a hurry to celebrate too early, having learned firsthand how quickly a single overlooked detail could undo an entire night of careful work. The Meridian 9 was towed out onto the runway just as the sky began to lighten. The rain had finally stopped, though the pavement remained slick and dark. David ran the engines through a full range of power settings while data streamed simultaneously to the technical team, the client's observers, and federal regulators watching from the control center. Every reading remained stable throughout. Mason noticed a minor fluctuation in one sensor feed but determined it was ordinary calibration drift rather than anything dangerous. He insisted on a cross-check before giving final approval. Jackson confirmed there was no remaining trace of malicious code or timing interference anywhere in the system. David requested a short test flight. Mason agreed only after 2 independent backup systems completed their checks without issue. Amelia chose not to board the aircraft herself, refusing to turn the flight into a promotional spectacle. She remained in the operations center, prepared to answer directly to the board. David and the test crew took the Meridian 9 down the runway. The entire control room fell silent the instant the wheels lifted off the ground. Engine power held perfectly steady throughout the climb. The aircraft completed a wide test loop above the bay. The transition between the primary and backup control systems occurred exactly as designed. David radioed back that the Meridian 9 was performing precisely as intended. The client agreed to move forward with the contract, though they requested a full independent security audit going forward. Amelia accepted the condition without hesitation or negotiation. The company's stock price gradually recovered once it publicly disclosed the sabotage attempt and the corrective steps already underway. Logan faced formal charges related to unauthorized system access, aviation equipment sabotage, securities fraud, and obstruction of the investigation. Aaron cooperated with authorities in exchange for reduced consequences. He confirmed that Logan had paid him to plant the credential theft device and to swap the timing module. Logan's plan had been to make the flight fail publicly while quietly shifting blame onto Mason's original design. Afterward, an allied group of investors intended to pressure the company into selling its technology at a severely reduced price. Amelia called a full company meeting soon after. She openly admitted that firing Mason had been a serious mistake. She did not place the entire blame on Logan alone. She accepted personal responsibility for trusting one-sided reports and for prioritizing deadlines over legitimate technical warnings. Mason stood near the back of the room, showing no trace of triumph on his face. When Amelia offered to reinstate him in his former role, he did not answer immediately. He told her the real issue was never just a job title. The company's entire culture needed to change so that any engineer could halt a process the moment they identified a genuine safety risk. The board agreed to establish an independent safety division, one that would not report to operations at all. Amelia asked Mason to lead it. Mason set a single condition in return: no employee should ever be punished again for refusing to sign a certification they genuinely believed was unsafe. Evelyn, who had once supported his dismissal without hesitation, now stood quietly at the back of the room, aware that the board's own eagerness for speed had helped create the conditions Logan exploited. She did not offer excuses when reporters later asked about the company's oversight failures. Instead, she promised a full review of every safety-related decision made over the previous year, a commitment the board honored in the months that followed. 1 month later, Apex Meridian completed a full company-wide audit. Investigators uncovered numerous governance gaps, and the board moved quickly to correct them. The approval process for any critical software update now required independent sign-off from 3 separate departments. Charlotte was placed in charge of ongoing compliance oversight. Jackson remained lead engineer, though now under a far stricter review structure. He personally apologized to Mason for trusting reports that later proved to be false. Mason did not blame him for that mistake. He said the real failure was never being misled in the first place, but refusing to reconsider once real evidence finally appeared. David continued serving as chief test pilot for the Meridian 9 program. The aircraft completed its official handover flight without a single incident. The original 3-plane contract remained fully intact, and the client indicated interest in purchasing additional units if the program continued performing reliably. The company chose not to turn Mason into a marketing symbol. At his own request, public attention stayed focused on the technical team as a whole and on the importance of rigorous safety procedure rather than on any one individual. Amelia met Mason inside the hangar after the official handover ceremony concluded. She handed him formal documentation naming him Director of System Safety. The salary increase mattered far less to him than the actual authority the role carried. The written terms allowed his division to ground any flight the moment legitimate technical concerns arose, without needing approval from anyone above him. Mason accepted the position. He was not returning to prove the company needed him. He was returning to make certain no other employee would ever be fired simply for stating honestly that a machine was not yet safe. Amelia apologized to him once more, this time with no board members present and no cameras recording the moment. Mason accepted her apology, though he made clear that real trust would have to be earned through consistent action over time. Amelia agreed completely. Their relationship settled into a foundation of professional respect, one that left room for something warmer to grow slowly in the future without forcing any dramatic romantic conclusion. Mason left the hangar as evening settled over the city. He called home to say he was on his way back. His daughter's voice came through briefly at the other end of the line, cheerful and brief, never appearing directly in the events of that long week. Before switching off the hangar lights, Mason turned back once more to look at the Meridian 9. The very aircraft that had once cost him his job now rested quietly beneath the overhead lights, calm and whole. He understood clearly that his refusal to stay silent was the exact thing that had ultimately saved the aircraft, the flight crew, and the company itself. The story closed on a simple new sign mounted outside the safety division's office, its words plain and unmistakable. No deadline, no contract, and no title is ever worth more than a human life. It would remain there for years afterward, a small reminder to everyone who walked past it that competence spoken quietly and honesty defended stubbornly could matter more than any title ever printed on a business card. Thank you for watching this story unfold, and stay close for more journeys where quiet courage changes everything.